Where there's a father wound, there's usually always a belief about not being good enough. When you have a father who is like critical, or even the father who is like volatile, what you end up with is this inner critic that is berating and harsh and dismissive and never good enough. You could have had the most amazing father in the world, but there's still some wounding there. A young boy is looking kind of structure, leadership, how to treat himself, how to talk to himself, how to be with himself as a man. Most men I ever talked to, the father was lacking, and emotionally is the most common one. We haven't learned from a father like how to be with emotions. What we do, we back down from them, we run away, we shut down, because he hasn't learned how to like put his heart into the world. So what do you do about it? Most healing is quite cyclical. You think you've tackled your I'm not good enough, and then it comes back up in a different guise 3 years later in your relationship or in your business or whatever it may be. The first part of healing, you must acknowledge. So why is it that you keep having the same relationship patterns and struggles? You know, maybe for you, it's something like passivity in relationships, struggling to, be in teamwork, speak up for yourself, open up, take risks, give direction, give leadership, right? For a man, there's this very particular type of wound that can play out time and time again if we don't start to look at it, we don't start to look at the components and where it's come from. And that's the father wound. This is something that affects every single man I've coached with, right? And the core questions I ask is about parents and their fathers, and we usually go deeper into it in a conversation, because the father is our first imprint of how we should be as a man, right? And if your parents are together, or you have a relationship that you see with your father in it, that becomes the imprint of how you should be as a man in relationship, right? And how he treats you while in that relationship or not in that relationship becomes really, really formative to how you show up in relationship and how you show up in life in general. This isn't just about relationships. I'm focused on relationship today because that's where I'm focusing, but this really will give you a picture of how your father wound is impacting your life in general, right? So I'm going to talk about what it is, the different kind of archetypes of men, the wounds and impacts it has on your relationships in particular, and then the steps you can do to start healing it. Because it's an important aspect, right? It's one of the first things that I had to do in my journey, and I've had to do it multiple times. And I'm here to tell you that too. It doesn't kind of completely end. It's layered, right? So you might find, the first time I started looking at my dad and our relationship, I was probably 25, 26. And I've had to probably revisit every few years and do some amount of work. That could just simply be a bunch of journal prompts. Sometimes it is something a bit deeper and a bit longer than that, but it's multi-layered, and you're going to see it comes out in different aspects of relationship and life and career and confidence and all these bits and pieces. So what is a father wound, right? It's a kind of psychological imprint, psychological wound that we get from the fathering we receive, and in particular from the things we felt we didn't get enough of, right? Or that weren't done the way we felt they should have been done. And it's important, this the way we felt or the way we thought as children, right? And from that very kind of egocentric place that kids have of how things should be, kids, when I was a child, I wasn't thinking about, the complexities of running a household or the complexities of finance, right? Or the complexities of the weight that my father might be carrying. I was just thinking about, how's he talking to me? How's he treating me? Right? And how does that make me feel? And I think that's really important, because we don't always realize this when we become adults. Like, oh, actually, my father was carrying a shitload of stuff, right? He had his own issues. He had his own wounding from his own father too, and his own mother. So it's important for us to kind of acknowledge that, right, off the bat. And this isn't about saying all our fathers are bad. You could have had the most amazing father in the world. And again, I've worked with men whose fathers were phenomenal, but there's still some wounding there. And even with the phenomenal dad, the dad who everybody looks up to or we think is amazing, there's often a very distinctive wound there as well, because of the fact that he was so amazing as well. And I'll probably touch on that later on. So ultimately, it's this psychological wound, right? About the needs that we had or didn't have. And some of those needs might be affirmation, emotional presence, and emotional dynamism as well. Emotional discipline, emotional expression, discipline, guidance, confidence giving, modeling of masculinity, how your father treated women as well becomes an important part, right? And all of these as young boys, we're looking for really ultimately, like a young boy is looking kind of structure, leadership, how to treat himself, how to talk to himself, how to be with himself as a man. These are the things we absorb through our father, right? So if you didn't have your biological father around, it will be the man who maybe was a father figure to you. And if you didn't have a father around at all, then the wounding is absence, right? And we're going to touch on that because I've got a few different archetypes of father that I commonly see with the men that I work with, right? So let's dive into those, actually. Let's get into those. The archetypes. So the first one I have is this kind of ghost father, right? This could be a man who's either completely absent and not in your life, right? Or the father who is like at home around, or you see him a little bit, but he's just like a ghost as a human being. You know, he's unreachable. He's emotionally kind of blank and empty. Like maybe he doesn't reflect back to you who you are. He doesn't ask you questions. He doesn't ask you how you're feeling. He doesn't pay attention to you. He doesn't notice your experience, right? This feeling we have from this ghost father is just growing up feeling unseen, unheard, unmet, unconnected with, right? You might even have felt like you wish you just didn't have him, right? Because you felt it would have been better just for him not to be there. It caused more harm being there than not, right? But generally, the ghost father is a man who is kind of struggles with intimacy and closeness. He may fear himself being seen, right? And being noticed. And maybe he grew up with the wound as the ghost father as well, a completely absent father, right? That's a very common one I've noticed as well. The second one I see a lot is the kind of critical, perfectionist, do things this way type of father. So it's call him kind of like the critical father, right? Father leads with judgment, yeah? High standards and can be low on like emotional warmth and connection. It's like, do this, don't do this way. And it can be very low on praise. Like this is an experience I had with my dad. I remember once I think I got 80% on a test and felt quite proud and told my dad I got 80%. And then his first question was, what happened to the other 20%? You know, it's that sort of thing where, you know, you'd be like, oh, I won this race. And he'll be like, what time did you get? You know, you got a time, and he'll go, oh, but didn't someone else get a better time before? Or you missed out on the record? You know, it's always the gap he's kind of speaking to between you and kind of perfection, or where he thinks you should have been instead of actually where you are. So you will always maybe found yourself pushing for his attention, for his like acknowledgement, right? And it might have come once or twice in your life, but you were seeking this acknowledgement from him, right? And he could never give it to you because he was critical. He was always looking at the gap. This is something that my own father actually was like. And I see a lot of guys like this as well. You get the passive father, right? This passive father, I think, is quite common. Kind, gentle, nice, lacks backbone. You know, he will defer to the mother a lot of what to do, how to be. Sometimes he's just like the easygoing guy. He's like, yeah, man, whatever. He, you know, sometimes it's a dad that's trying to be cool, but often it's a dad who is just lacking in you know, masculinity himself, direction, and backbone, you could call it, right? So there's no kind of leading, there's no sort of direction given to you as a young boy. And then often this is paired with a mother who is probably quite dominant, yeah, quite masculine. She's running everything because dad's passive. And sometimes it's a dynamic that both of them need. You know, he's looking for some direction, gets it from a mother. And sometimes he's dominated by and has been dominated and emasculated by mother over time. And sometimes it can be due to do with people's earnings, where the woman earns more and he feels emasculated, and so forth. But he's just a passive dad. So to the boy you grew up, you don't get this authority and direction model to you, right? You get, you know, you might lack in this kind of emotional support as well. Or you start to go to your mum as a direction for how to be a man, which can be problematic for men often. And the fourth one I've got here is a kind of dominant, volatile father, right? This can be the man who can be very loving and kind and caring and directional, but can also then be violent as well and dominant, right? So he might dominate you through intensity or anger or fear, You know, this is a very old school way of parenting. Sometimes it includes violence, like, you know, beating, hitting, and all sorts of things like that. Abuse is the one I'm looking for. And inside of this, you learn this kind of almost a lack of safety with father, but also with anger. You don't get a good relationship with anger because you see it as volatile, and you've seen your father be volatile, and you see strength as something that is displayed through like threat, intent, domination, right? So you control through domination. That's what you absorb, right? From this sort of father. That's what starts to come up. So each of these archetypes is slightly different. I've only given you a few here, one of the main ones that I see. And you can have a combination of two. You could have a kind of passive. You could have a father who is a bit of a ghost father, a bit absent, but also a little bit critical, right? You could have a father who is quite dominant most of the time, who is also absent, you know, or distant and not around. He's only comes to life when there's something to be angry about. Or you might have a dad who's like perfectionist / passive most of the time, you know, leads with judgment, is passive most of the time. So you can have combinations of these. It's just looking for what's kind of dominant. So how does this fatherhood impact a man's kind of inner world? This is important because this is something that we don't always realize, we don't always notice. One of the most common things I see in the inner world is a belief that boys is created for them about not being good enough. Where there's a father wound, there's usually always a belief about not being good enough. So many men I've coached, like, they have this internal belief of not being good enough, right? That's what's there. That's what's really present for them. I'm not good enough. And it's plagues them, especially when combined with this next piece, which is the inner critic, right? So when you have a father who is like critical, or even the father who is like volatile, right? What you end up with is this inner critic that is berating and harsh and dismissive and never good enough. And it might not be that your dad was critical to you directly. He might have been critical of himself as well. So what you kind of absorb is the way he speaks. So he might speak to himself and say, "Oh man, that's not good enough. What's wrong with you? You're a piece of shit." He may never say those words to you directly. He may be very congratulatory and so forth to you, right? But you absorb the words you hear him say, right? Most commonly. And that becomes your inner critic. The third thing, I'm not going to number these. I can't bother this numbering business. You don't need numbers. The next one of how it impacts a man's inner world is around the fear of failure. I think an important part of fathering our kids is kind of teaching them the emotional regulation that is required around failure and mistakes. Like teaching a young boy, like, you're going to make a mistake and it's okay. We can retry. We can do it again, right? And so it creates this fear of failure, fear of making mistakes. Or what I see also in men is like this, when they do make mistakes, I see this in younger boys, is they get very, very dysregulated, angry, frustrated, annoyed, right? And this one actually comes from directing your kids and teaching them there's a particular way to do things. So if you had a father who was like, there's a particular way to do things, you have to do it like this and do it like that, you're going to have a lot of anxiety around mistakes because you want to get it right. You don't want to get it wrong. You don't want to make a mistake, right? So what it creates is a huge amount of kind of anxiety that kind of happens for you as a man. Another thing I see in a man's internal world, often with a fatherhood, is this kind of emotionally shutting down, right? So he was never taught by his father how to be with emotions, how to contend with emotions, how to wrestle with them, right? How to create comfort in them, right? Or to be present with his discomfort. Because this is another important aspect, right? We're going to be uncomfortable. We're going to have uncomfortable emotions. And if we don't learn how to be with those emotions and be co-regulated, sat down with another another man with us and show us that it's okay, I can have these feelings and they will dissipate. We learn to shut down emotionally. Another thing I see a lot with men is that they can't express their emotions, particularly difficult emotions, like shame or frustration and sadness, upset and hurt, right? And affection as well. And it's a particular way, affection. So these harder emotions, they never learn because they never see a man, their father, express those emotions and then make it through. Yeah. and like come out the other side and be like, oh, I felt this was going on. I'm coming out the other side and I've transmuted it. So what happens when he starts to feel these uncomfortable emotions, he shuts down, or he tries to suppress those emotions a lot of the time, right? Because he hasn't learned to kind of be with those as well. Another aspect, it just popped into my head just there, conflict. And I could probably touch on this in the relationship one, but this is life conflict, right? Which is when there's a conflict in life, doesn't know how to handle it with people because he's never seen his father deal with the uncomfortable, maybe even the aggression or assertiveness to be with conflict. Like something comes up in a shop, like, I don't know, they give you the wrong order or something like that and be like, hey, this is the wrong food. I ordered something else. Because if you've had a passive father, a father's like, don't cause any trouble, don't make any sound, don't disrupt, right? You learn to do the same thing in your life. So then you become that person. You don't assert yourself in life situations and in work situations as well. And one of the other ones, and some of these are coming to my head now, not even in the notes I wrote before, is around confidence, right? I see a lot of men who have quite low confidence, and it's because they never had a father who would say, like, you're doing well, you're capable, right? You can do this. So what happens is in a world is like he never learned how to kind of be his own cheerleader. So he's always at the mercy of his inner critic. So the confidence is always this struggling place because he can't lift himself up because the inner critic is so harsh and heavy. But there's this internal feeling of confidence and never need to be like, I believe in myself. Yeah. Another internal world issue I see with a lot of men is like feeling like a boy. This can often happen when we've had a dominant father or dominant mother as well, if I'm honest, where we are continually treated like children, right? You're always treated like a child. Like you can never do things quite right. You never know how to be a man and so forth. And this can also come with like, we've been treated like kids. You've been treated like a little baby boy for too long. So you never feel like an adult. Even when you go off into the big wild world and you do your thing, you still feel like a little boy. And then the last thing I see again that impacts a man's inner world or goes on in his inner world is around risk, around this kind of either too much risk taking or not enough risk taking. And to be honest, most of the men that come to me per se, it's not enough risk taking. They're too afraid to take risks. They're too afraid to approach women. They're too afraid to go travel on their own or too afraid to take certain risks with their life because they never saw or got an imprint of like someone teaching them to believe in themselves, to take risks and it was okay. Or they had a very risk-averse, passive type of father who was always like, ooh, careful, don't take any risks. Something bad might happen. Or a father who's very anxious that would tell them about all the terrible things that's going to happen if they travel to Thailand or they go to India or whatever. You know, so their first thing is always risk-averseness, right? That's something I see a hell of a lot with guys. So how does this impact, how does a fatherhood impact our relationship? Because it does massively, right? It becomes very painfully obvious. It becomes very clear, even from those things I said before, that, you know, if you're a woman listening to this, you might be like, oh my God, like I've met men who have been like this. And you may even, as a woman, thought to yourself, oh, all men are like this, right? Because most men have some level of fatherhood, right? And the severity obviously can be different in the different types of archetype of father as well. If a man hasn't actively decided to, you know, learn to be the sort of man he wants to be and modeled that in some way on men around him or so forth. So how does it affect relationships? So this is what men do. This is their impact, right? The first one is passivity, right? Being passive, avoiding planning things, avoiding deepening the relationship, avoiding taking initiative, avoiding leadership, right? It's this kind of passivity because there's a lot of it's about fear of taking risks with the heart because it hasn't learned how to like put his heart into the world, which is something a father should really teach us to do, you know, giving us direction. So has this kind of embodied passivity that happens, especially as the stakes start to rise. So you might find that for you as a man, early days of relationship, you're like, good, you know, you're setting things up, you're organizing things. But as things get more serious, you start to avoid making plans in case it's the wrong ones. You know, maybe she's commented on the choice of things, the choice of clothes you've chosen before, right? And now you're like, oh my God, I don't want to get it wrong. So it becomes this passivity, right? Not leading, not giving direction, not like deepening the connection in the relationship, right? Because you're trying to avoid making mistakes, avoid getting it wrong, avoid having any risks that you feel could hurt you or hurt the relationship. And now the second one here is around emotions, and this can be this emotional disappearing. But the other side of this is, I'll say that one next, right? Emotionally disappearing, because said man, us men, we haven't learned from our father, like how to be with emotions, how to express them, how to like be strong with our emotions. Yeah, we didn't learn this. So we actually feel quite weak in relation to our emotions, and emotions can be very intense. So what we do, we back down from them, we run away, we shut down. And some of you might be like, oh, that's all men. And I go as far as say, yeah, like I said, most men I ever talk to, there's some sort of father wound somewhere where their father was lacking, and emotionally is the most common one, because our fathers, our grandfathers were born in an era where, stiff upper lip and all that. And most countries around the world took on the Western view of this. Even my family are Jamaican, and it was, Jamaican men aren't traditionally emotional, whether that's been able to, and also you can have the impacts of things like slavery around fatherhood, and so forth, and different cultures around how a father should be with their children. And a lot of West African guys, and their fathers were very distant. It was just like they bring down the money and that was it. Some of them barely knew their dads, even though they lived in the same house. So they never got emotional nourishment. So they never learned how to kind of be with that themselves. The third thing, and this is the one I've shoehorned in a bit because I've remembered it, is validation. If you didn't get the validation you wanted from your father, a man will often seek it in the woman he's with. So one of the things will become is that you'll look to your partner to validate you, to tell you like you're being a good boy, you're doing it right. So you're constantly in this game of doing things, and this is kind of a nice guy thing of doing things you think your partner's going to say, well done, you're good, you're great. And that can sound fine to do, but it becomes quite toxic because you stop doing the things, you stop being the man you want to be, you start being the man that's going to get validation. And it can actually really destroy polarity and connection in the relationship after a time when that happens. The fourth thing, hypersensitivity to criticism. And this comes in from the part of the wound I talked about not being good enough. When we have this kind of internal feeling, this internal story, which is strong for me and many of my clients, I've spoken to someone else this morning about this actually, I'm not good enough, right? I'm not good enough is a kind of wound of shame. And whenever anything occurs in our vicinity, in our relationship, that could point to the truth that it could be true that I'm not good enough, right? Shame will be triggered. So my partner says, oh, you didn't close the door last night. What happened? Maybe the front door. I didn't lock the front door last night. Instantly, I'm like, oh my God, there was a way I should have done something. I didn't do it. I'm not good enough. I might get defensive. I might withdraw. I might people please. I might avoid. I might get angry. Because if I have to acknowledge that I didn't do that thing properly, the next route for me to go unconsciously is to shame. And shame is very uncomfortable to feel because it means I'm bad, right? No, I did something bad. I am bad, right? So this becomes this hypersensitivity to criticism, feedback, even someone like directing you like, oh, you should take this next right. It's faster. Suddenly you get defensive. Like, oh, I know how to get to this place, or blaming other people for things that you've done wrong in the moment, like you've taken a wrong turning and you might be turned to your partner in the chair next to you and you're like, why didn't you tell me that the next turning was coming up? You can't be with any mistake that you make. And this can be a really big one for guys. Number 5, an attraction to unavailable partners. This is where, and this is so seductive and happened to me many times, especially in my earlier life, before I did the work, to be honest. where we have this unfinished business of our parents, mothers, fathers. And if your father was absent, not there, or emotionally unavailable, at some point in your life, you would have been attracted to, or continue to be attracted to, unavailable partners, or partners who are just out of reach of connecting with deeply, like just beyond you. Like you just can't get there because it's the imago, the image of what you experienced in childhood with your own father. And it sounds kind of weird, right? Because it's your father, and you kind of feel like, oh, that's a cross of genders. But we, as Pavel Hendrick and Kelly LeHelen, I think Kelly LeHelen Hunt or Ken, from Get the Love You Want, they talk about this imago, this unfinished business that we have with our parents that we project onto a partner and try and fix or win the game, as I see it, beat the boss with our partners. Number 6? Yes, number 6. This inner critic that starts to leak out. So this is where our inner critic starts to leak out because we're so critical of ourselves, we become the critical person of our partners in our relationship. And this kind of comes with the hypersensitive criticism. These two go together like, chalk and cheese, not chalk and cheese, like hand in hand, right? If you are sensitive to criticism, you're probably also likely to be dishing out criticism. And it won't be like necessarily big criticalness. It could be the criticalness in your head is wild, but it's just nitpicking little things like, do this way. Oh, you should do this way. No, you shouldn't do that with your life. You should do this. It's these little corrections, right, that you probably mask as, oh, I'm just helping my partner. I'm being supportive. But if you ask them how it feels to them, they tell you it just feels like you're constantly criticizing them. Nothing ever feels good enough, right? Nothing I do is ever the right way. That might be something that you hear your partner say, to you. Because this is what often happens. I think that's enough. I think that's enough of the obvious ones I see in men in relationships as well. I'm just letting my brain whirl a little bit and see what's there. Commitment. This is often when you've seen a father who is either passive in relationship, or you see that he is creating distance, right? So that can be the kind of ghost father, the passive father. I've seen a lot of these guys really struggle with commitment, right? Especially men who have had mothers who are quite dominant and dads who are quite passive. There's this fear of being kind of overwhelmed by the feminine. And overwhelmed by a woman. So there's this kind of avoidance of commitment and relationship. Because they kind of don't want to be made to be really passive and walked all over or dominated, right? So there's this fear there that can happen, that they just think they're going to relive their father's experience. So what do you do about it, right? Because it's not a life sentence. I said it's a kind of cyclical healing. I think most healing is quite cyclical. Just from my experience, things come back in different ways and different life periods. You think you've tackled your I'm not good enough, and then it comes back up in a different guise 3 years later in your relationship or in your business or whatever it may be. So that's my belief. Things that can be cyclical. It doesn't, it's good nor bad. It's just the way that I've seen it with people. I find that I'm often having the same conversations with men, maybe 2 or 3 times, but in different ways or different depth, because after the first time something's new, the second time they have a new awareness, a deeper awareness, and the third time they're like, oh my God, this has 2 more layers than what we first talked about. And you're like, yeah, but you can only now hear these 2 layers or see them because of the awareness that you've built up through our coaching conversations or the coaching container or the program that they've been in with me. So, healing. You must acknowledge the first part of healing. You must acknowledge awareness. You must acknowledge, like, I didn't get the things I wanted from my father. What did I not receive from my father that I wanted / needed? Let yourself say out loud, I didn't get love and attention. I didn't get affection. He never told me he loved me. He never told me he was proud of me. Maybe you have the opposite. I could do no wrong in my father's eyes. Maybe you had that. I didn't mention this archetype of father, like the perfect dad who was like perfect to everybody and you could never live up to him, Maybe you never got the human version of him. I needed more softness. I needed him to show me the world, to give me confidence. Say it out loud, write it down, journal it, do it right now. Pause this. Because this is where the acknowledgement becomes really important, because if you don't acknowledge it, you can't feel what's there. You can't feel what's there, like what was missing, what it felt like, the ache of that. Yeah? Because there's an ache of what you desired you didn't get. There's actually a set of questions I run through with some of my clients, and definitely men in my group, and in my upcoming group program, Relate. We're going to do a whole section on this, the father wound, going through these questions that really allows us to acknowledge what we didn't get, acknowledge what we really wanted, right? And acknowledge how the man really was and how we might want him to be a bit different. Because it's really important to kind of acknowledge all those things in a way that feels embodied and out loud. Number 2, separate the human dad from like the projection you have of him. What do I mean? So there's the kind of dad who was a human man, who had his own life and struggles. That's the human man. And then there's the kind of father that you view, the projection of all the bad things, all the ways he didn't show up. The human man has like things he did do well, ways he did show up, but he had his own struggles as well. Just separating those two, I think is really useful. Of like seeing him as human, seeing your father as human, as a human man who was imperfect and was also perfect in his own way, right? And like acknowledging that, just that. And then another step here is kind of inside of this, which is seeing the kind of archetype. Connor Beaton talks about this a lot, this archetype of father. You know, the things that you wish you'd got from him. Like the structure, the stability, the boundaries, wisdom, direction, leadership. Like, look at these, right? And just kind of build a picture of, for each of these things, maybe you have a man or men that personify those things in their healthy sense. Like maybe, for instance, I had a cricket coach, a guy called John Smith. He was amazing, right? And to me, in many ways, he was a father figure. And he was just like, he was caring and gentle, but also like really believed that I was good at cricket, you know? So he gave me that confidence in my cricket ability that no one else really had done before. Maybe one or two other men had done, but my father definitely didn't. So he would go into that way of like, you know, imbuing confidence, you know, and just start to think of those traits, because this is going to come back a bit useful later on. The next step is you got to feel the unexpressed emotion. You know, this can be difficult. This works really well in group settings, in paired settings. So if you have a man that you can talk to about that, like actually feeling, not just telling the story from this very intellectual level of like, oh, my dad did this and he didn't do that. It's actually, my dad did this and how it made me feel, and how it still makes me feel now. I still feel this yearning for a man to show up for me. I still have this yearning for, you know, an elder to guide me in life. Like actually speak it out loud, say it, feel it, express it, breathe it. And then the next one, this one can be really difficult for men to do. What are the negative traits, ways of being that you inherited from your father? This can be really difficult because sometimes we want to push this away, this kind of the shadow of our father. We want to push it away and be like, no, I'm nothing like him. I'm completely different. But no matter what you do, there'll be aspects of him that live in you, because most likely he was in your life. And even if he wasn't in your life, genetics, you can't run from them, you know? Acknowledging that, like, I emotionally shut down like my dad does. I have little eccentricities, is that the word? Like my dad does, you know? Even some of my mannerisms, people tell me, are similar to him, right? So just acknowledging that, right, is really important. Just acknowledging how you are the same, right? So acknowledging the shadow. And then have a second column, which is acknowledging where you're different. Yeah, acknowledge where you're different. Another important thing, right? And then last one, you have to father yourself. That's the next thing. You have to connect with your inner father, right? That's why I mentioned in that step before earlier is like, think of the different aspects. Like maybe there's a man you know, or a man you kind of see in the world whose leadership is like so on point. Or maybe someone like David Goggins would be your kind of like motivator, like motivating. He's a very motivating person, isn't he? Strength, for instance, maybe not emotional strength. I don't think he displays so much of that. Or wisdom, you might think of a person, or even a character from a movie I think can be useful, who embodies wisdom. Like you might think of Gandhi, or you might think of Muji, for example, or Ram Dass, you know? And then you start to father yourself. So you might go, okay, I want wisdom. I want to gather wisdom. So wisdom is something that's like knowledge that is used, you know, not just knowledge in the head. So you might go and read a bunch of books by Ram Dass. And then you might start practicing the wisdom that you've learned, yeah, that you've taken in. You might go into spaces where you get to debate things, yeah, using your wisdom in action, right? For example, and as an act of fathering yourself. Or, for example, maybe boundaries, right, has been a thing for you that you've struggled with because you're passive, for example. Like you let people walk all over your boundaries. So then you get to practice being boundaried, yeah? Or setting boundaries with your inner critic. Or maybe your inner critic is some of the things you need to father, because there's a boundary of your inner critic. Is actually do some of the healing work with your inner critic, because that's really important to do. Or maybe you need to build disciplines. You need to bring on your David Goggins, yeah? And you start to commit to doing a practice every morning or every evening, or whatever it may be, right? Or you want that more emotional expression. So then you start to do that. Okay, let me practice emotional expression. Let me do some improv classes, or let me do some classes on emotional intelligence, or go on some retreat about sexuality, for instance, because I can see like, oh, I'm really shut off from my sexuality because, you know, I grew up in a house where no one talked about sex. You father yourself. You start to build up the capabilities and abilities yourself. And you start to talk to yourself from this father, this archetypal father that you want to embody and have. You know, you can start having internal conversations with your inner father, you know, the man that you really wanted, has the traits from those amalgamation of those different people that you might map out. And you start to father yourself from that place. You start to talk to yourself from that place. Like, oh, I did this thing at work. Well done. You might even just say it to yourself, well done, son. You know, imagine you're having a conversation with that inner father. It's powerful. It sounds mad, like, oh, I'm having this conversation with myself. People that talk to themselves are generally more intelligent and have better mental health. There's a reason, because it works. Yeah? Fantastic. Fantastic. And then this will help your relational abilities as well, obviously. Yeah? So I'm not going to recap. You know, I went through what the father wound is. I'm doing a bit of recap. The different fathers, how that kind of affects your inner world, how that affects your relationships, and what you can do to heal it. Now, the father wound spans a lot of different areas, as you can see. Really, like most men, some of their biggest issue is their father wound. As I said in my program Relate, I'm going to be covering this. We're going to be talking about father wound. We're going to do mother wound as well. And we're going to do some work around inner critic. Definitely, that's just inside of one module, and there's 7 different modules. If you're interested in this is all about equipping you with the skills and traits and abilities to be the man you want to be inside of relationship, right? And to cultivate the quality and type of relationship you want. So you stop making the same mistakes and sabotaging, right? It's going to be a 6-7 month long program. You get 1 year's access. It's going to be phenomenal. Obviously going to be phenomenal because I'm teaching it. It's going to be great. We're going to have wonderful fun. And initially it's only going to be 10 men to join. So if you're interested, there is in the show notes, there is a link to a waitlist. And the people on the waitlist get first dibs. If you're not on the waitlist, you're probably going to miss out this time round. Yeah? Fantastic. That's it with me. If you've enjoyed this episode, drop a comment below in the comment section. What did you learn? What are you taking away? What questions do you have? Also, I never really asked this, but I'd love you to do a review on Apple, Spotify, I think that's the only place to do reviews. Little stars goes a long way to just like boosting the ratings and getting more people listening to it. You know, a big thank you to all the people who've done it already as well. I see you, especially you guys who write stuff on Apple Music. I read them. Big thank you. Thank you for listening. Show this of a man that you know needs it. Ciao, ciao.